Well, first let me just thank all of you for being here. I know that there are a number of erudite minds in the audience that are far beyond my understanding on this issue, but I am very grateful to every one of you for being here. And I want to, if I could, start out just by thanking my staff. They're all wonderful, but I'm going to try to bring out two people especially, Ari Zimmerman and Major Elizabeth Kreft, who you've already met, and I'm very grateful to them. They certainly are absolutely the ones that help make this happen. And again, I appreciate you being here. The video that you just saw is also in your chair, and that's thanks to Frank Gaffney and the Center for Security Policy. Where is Frank? Oh, I'm sorry, he's right in front of me. But again, I appreciate all of you being here. We're going to be joined by Newt Gingrich here in a few moments. Scooter Libby, Joe McClelland. You saw Joe on the video. Undersecretary Bill Bryan will be represented, I understand, by Mr. Friedman, and he's here. And of course, the members of Congress are always grateful that you're here. Ken Calvert and my friend Joe Pitts, and I know there's probably others out there that I don't see, but grateful to you for being here. You know, there's a comment that sometimes there is a point in the life of every problem when it is big enough to be seen and still small enough to be solved. And I really feel, in a sense, that's where we are with electromagnetic pulse. This is not a new issue. This is something that goes back to the Cold War, when we essentially identified the cause, or the phenomena itself, when we had Starfish Prime and other nuclear tests that caused electric lines to fuse together 900 miles away. We didn't exactly understand all of what it was about, but the Soviets certainly took it seriously, and they came up with an actual EMP offensive capability of about a 25 megaton warhead, because at the time our infrastructure was far more robust than it is now, simply because it was simpler. You know, Einstein said, make things as simple as you can, but no simpler. Well, at that time we had a very simple infrastructure, and in a sense, one of the reasons why we are now more vulnerable than we've ever been is not because EMP is any worse than it ever was. The geomagnetic disturbance, the potential of high-altitude electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear weapon, those are all essentially the same. We've had some advances in the potential of enhancing gamma ray output from nuclear warheads that can make a much smaller weapon have the same effect as that big 25 megaton warhead. We can do today, with enhanced capability, with 4 or 5 kilotons, what it used to take 25 megatons to do. Now, for those of you in the audience that understand some of the nuclear nomenclature, you understand that's a significant advance in this whole situation, and it represents a pretty profound implication for the free world. But with that said, the real problem is that we have essentially become victims of our own capability, of our own sophistication, where we've engineered our electric grid to the point of great vulnerability. Where in times past we had major, some of the old knife switches, some of the things that just were almost impervious to almost anything. You could hit them with a brick and not have, but now we have a lot of our SCADA controls that are, have computer chips with circuits in them, maybe 30 molecules wide. They don't even make a flash bulb anymore. And of course, we have tied our grid together because we are capable of coming up with a smart grid. You know, we're really pretty bright folks, we think sometimes. And we have made it to where there's an antenna-like capability now that multiplies the actual current in the line. You know, if you've got 200 kilovolts per meter, every meter you have an advance in the voltage. So the point is that we are sort of victims of our own scientific advancement. And now we find ourselves in very significant vulnerability. And I would just remind you that history is always replete with examples of people letting something sneak up on them. You know, in this, I think it was 1620s, London. Speaker Gingrich, he just came in. So, but in 1620, London, nearly 90% of it burned, and it wasn't because they didn't know about fire. It was simply because they had forgotten how serious that it could be under the right circumstances, the right wind patterns and all the things. They built their homes close together, and they suffered terribly for it. And all through history, a couple of things are true, that most of these dangerous, I think the gentleman mentioned black swan events, usually catch us unaware. And then we look back and we say, well, why did it catch us unaware? It shouldn't have. But that's generally the trend. The only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And so it's incumbent upon us then to look at each one of these situations as clearly as we can. Now, with some of the advancing missile threats throughout the world, it's especially significant. When you have North Korea within a couple of years of being able to range the entire United States with their missile capability and not needing a reentry vehicle for EMP attacks, the implications are, do we know their address? Do they know that? Yes. We understand that there's still a great deterrence from them doing something, but the point is, why should the United States of America be vulnerable to that kind of potentially devastating attack? And of course, with Iran, I have a mindset here that I hope I don't have to express to all of you, and that missile threat is growing as well. They've already demonstrated ICBM technology and capability that I think is of great concern. And of course, there are two components to every threat, is intent and capability. When we talk about jihadist governments, the intent question really is no longer a question. It's their capability. We need to make sure that their capability is there. All of you heard about the severe space weather, that it's just simply a matter of time. We don't know when that will be, so we should be prepared to it. To that end, we have introduced the SHIELD Act, which will be introduced into Congress today. And the SHIELD Act is sort of an offshoot of the old GRID Act. At the time, there was concern on the part of the Armed Services Committee that the GRID Act did not include weaponized EMP, and so we wrote letters to the Energy and Commerce Committee. They very kindly put our amendments in, and we were all happy. And the bill passed the House without any dissent. It went out of the House unanimously. But unfortunately, when it got to the Senate, some of you may have heard that sometimes the senators have differing perspectives that get in the way of things. We understand that the Democrats here, from my perspective, and we love all the Democrats, they're the august opposition, but the Senate's the real enemy. And so, no. But the point is, it did get stopped there, not because of the EMP provisions, but because of the differences of opinion related to the cybersecurity threats. General Dempsey, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has called cybersecurity vulnerability and EMP kissing cousins, because they both affect potentially the same networks. And so it's important to realize that while we're justified in our concern over cybersecurity, and I've been very supportive of trying to meet that threat, we need to understand that EMP has the potential to be the ultimate cybersecurity threat, because it can take our source of power and our source of computation completely away from us, or at least that is the case in a worst case scenario. Now, last couple points here, and then I'll tell you about the GRID Act, and we'll introduce some folks that have come to talk to you. First of all, the SHIELD Act is different than the GRID Act in that it calls upon us to use hardware-based solutions rather than just procedural solutions. Many times we think that if we just prepare for something or we know how to work around it, we'll be all right. But we learned a long time ago with lightning, which lightning is electromagnetic pulse. It's the E2 band of electromagnetic pulse. We learned a long time ago that we couldn't predict where it was going to hit, and we didn't want to try to move houses out of the way of storms, so we put up lightning rods. And that's essentially, in the most simplistic terms, what we'd hope to be able to do for our modern day grid, is to put up either neutral phase blockers or capacitors, something to protect our transformers from major surges that could cause them under load to burn themselves up, and to, again, cause this what could be a cataclysmic loss of electricity. The GRID Act had no such provisions in it as far as hardware-based solutions, but the SHIELD Act does. It says, let's not put ourselves in the position of guessing. Let's put ourselves in the position that if it happens, that it's mitigated. And that's as simple as I can say to you, and it's an important piece of legislation. Of course, there are always differences of opinion, especially in our civilian grid issues. Most of the military groups, we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the last few decades mitigating this threat for our military apparatus. We've hardened our nuclear missile defense capabilities. We've hardened our triad. We've hardened everything that would keep us from being able to give a very significant response to a potential enemy. But we've failed to harden our civilian grid, and our military is 99% dependent on our civilian grid. And to me, that is the greatest concern. Now, the SHIELD Act does not mitigate against all of the effects of EMP, but what it will do, once implemented, it will make sure that if our grid does go down from a major EMP attack, that we're able to bring it back up in a reasonable time. Just like when a lightning storm hits, you know, some of you remember some recent storms here, it challenged our ability to get the grid back up right quick. But this will allow us to bring the grid back, and then it's just simply an inconvenience. And I started out by saying that there is a moment in the life of every problem when it is big enough to be seen and still small enough to be addressed. And I believe we live in that moment. And I'm going to introduce a gentleman, if I can give a shameless political plug, that I supported for President of the United States. But he's one of the brightest minds in the universe, and everybody knows that. Sometimes I'm sure he kind of gets tired of hearing the same thing in that regard. But he has been a very prescient voice on this issue among many others, and we're going to have other people that we're going to introduce you to later that are going to be some experts that you can ask questions of. And again, I'm just grateful that you're all here. My purpose is not to get everybody to go out and prepare for cataclysmic EMP. Because let me say to you, if one really bad worst case scenario hits, it's the human nature that we need to fear more than the physical challenges. And it is something that we must put ourselves to prevent. This is something that we can't try to mitigate or ameliorate afterwards. We have to prevent this. And the good news is we can. It's quite simple. We have the technology. It's not expensive. It won't cost taxpayer dollars. We have a way to fix this, and we should proceed to do that. And with that I'd like to introduce Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Thank you all very much. And let me start by commending Trent Franks for this extraordinarily important initiative. And I'll explain how important it is in just a minute. But I also want to recognize three other people. Roscoe Bartlett, who when he was in the Congress did extraordinary work, beginning with bringing together 7 nuclear physicists, all of them with background in looking at nuclear war and working on issues during the Cold War. And the 7 of them came together and said without any question that electromagnetic pulse is real. It is a serious and potentially catastrophic threat. It is being consciously worked on by the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, and that we have every reason to see this as, in many ways, either the highest value or, with cyber war, the 2 highest values, which make almost all the rest of our defense spending less important. If you were establishing priorities and you were serious about avoiding a catastrophic event, you would say that this is one of the most important things that you have to do. I also want to recognize and commend Frank Gaffney, who has tirelessly, for well over a decade, tried to sound the alarm to this country and get the country to understand that this is not something where we would have a minor defeat. This is not something where we would be embarrassed. This could be the kind of catastrophe that ends civilizations. And that's not an exaggeration. And the fourth person I want to recognize has done the best single job of explaining why that's not an exaggeration. That's my good friend and co-author, Bill Forstchen, who wrote a remarkable book called 1 Second After. And if any of you want to get a flavor for what would happen in the real world if the electricity system collapsed, 1 Second After is an amazing story of a small town in North Carolina and the process of trying to recover. And it just, you suddenly realize how many different things you depend on for electricity. Starting, for example, for refrigeration for a variety of drugs, both for patients who have mental problems and, for example, for diabetes and for other things. I mean, you start going down the list within 2 or 3 weeks, all of this is gone. And so it's literally that decisive a change. Now, the reason it's potentially so catastrophic is if you burn out the generators, they're not replaceable. This is a multi-year problem. Today, almost all of them are built overseas. So this is a fundamentally different thing than having a blackout that lasts for 2 days. And it leads to a cascading series of crises that you have to pay attention to. I think that there are two profound reasons for taking this seriously, and I think that the SHIELD Act, that what Congressman Trent Franks is doing is exactly the right general direction. The first is man-made disaster. That is, an opponent who figures out how to use an EMP event. And the reason I began focusing on this a decade ago is there are very few events that you can't recover from. You can recover from 9/11. You can recover from Pearl Harbor. You can rebuild your capacity pretty rapidly once you've decided to do it. This is really different. This creates such a collapse of our fundamental productive capacity that you could literally see civilization crash and tear itself apart fighting over survival internally. So this is a really big deal, and with modern enhanced capabilities, you're starting at weapons down in the 100 kiloton level that could set off at the right altitude to maximize its spread, could have an extraordinary effect on half the country. So this is something you got to look at. And it also raises, frankly, the question, for example, of the North Koreans of ever allowing them to fire a ballistic missile, because you have no idea what they put on that missile. And if they could take out half the United States electricity pattern with one missile, there's a very real possibility they would. So this is a serious long-term problem on a scale that we have not confronted. Very different, I would argue, even than nuclear war, because unless you're expecting a spasm nuclear war with hundreds of missiles, the odds are very high you'd recover. It would be horrible, you'd lose a lot of people, but you would recover pretty rapidly from 2 or 3 or 4 missiles. It would be a terrible event, but it would not be a civilization-ending event. But 2 or 3 or 4 missiles that have EMP devices against a country that has not taken the right prudent steps, I believe would be an extraordinary risk. So I think that the SHIELD Act moves us in exactly the right general direction. I also think that that assessing our vulnerability to EMP should be a routine part annually for the Defense Department and Homeland Security to really rigorously look at how vulnerable are we, how dangerous is this, and what else do we have to do. And I'm encouraged at what's happened recently in Maine, where people went out and made the case and the legislature said, yeah, this is right. And so Maine is the first state in the country that has actually taken practical, common sense steps in the direction of shielding us from this kind of a problem. And I think it encourages me to believe that with Trent Frank's leadership and the leadership of the other members who are here today, that we can in fact educate the nation and get the nation to demand that we take these simple prudential steps. And I'll just close with this thought. You take the defense budget, the Homeland Security budget, and you ask yourself, where on that list of priorities would the cost of not being prepared for EMP be? And my guess is you can find literally hundreds of billions of dollars of less important investments than making sure that we are in fact secure if one of our opponents, or if we get a natural event and you get the kind of solar flare you had in 1859, which is probably inevitable over a long enough period of time, but there are arguments whether it's a 150-year event or a 500-year event. There's no argument that it can happen, because we know as a fact that in 1859 it did happen, and it really disrupted the primitive electric systems of 1859. That same event today, and I think that there's just a report that came out actually from Lloyd's of London estimating that that kind of event today could knock out all electricity between New York and Washington for the next 2 years. So there's a practical, natural reason to want to be protected, and there's an equally practical, man-made reason to want to be protected. And I believe that the SHIELD Act is a very important first step towards doing that. I'll do everything I can to make sure that we get this passed and signed into law, and I hope all of you will decide after today to do the same thing. Thank you all very, very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, just briefly, we're going to have a question and answer session with some experts here in a few moments. Mr. Gingrich will be joining that panel. But I'd like to introduce our co-chair of this caucus, and also want to thank Congressman Andy Harris, and Congressman Burgess, I think, was back there. I'm sorry? Oh, there he is. Congressman Burgess is stuck past me. He does that now and then. But in any case, we appreciate both of you being here. But I'd like to introduce now Congressman Doug Lamborn from Colorado. He is our co-chair, a precious friend, and very committed to this cause. And I'd like for him to say a few, and he after that, we'll have the answer questions.
Thanks, Trent. Very briefly, I just want to join with Trent in welcoming and showing appreciation to all of you for being here. I enjoyed what Speaker Gingrich had to say, and I look forward to what the subject matter experts are going to say. You have this DVD at your chairs. Make use of it. Show it to friends. Look at it yourself. And once again, this act we're introducing today, I'm a co-sponsor, the SHIELD Act, is a great piece of legislation. We're going to work hard on it. Hopefully this time it'll pass the House and the Senate and get signed into law. It's prudent, like the Speaker said, extremely cost-effective, minimal, without heavy government mandates. It's a great piece of legislation. Trent Franks has shown a lot of leadership in this. Trent is no shrinking violet, and he sometimes gets into controversial but good areas of legislation. In fact, we're voting on one of those later today and tomorrow. But this is a no-brainer. This is something, no matter your political persuasion, if you just believe in national security, it's something that you can get behind, the SHIELD Act. So once again, thank you all for being here. Trent, back to you.
Like my diplomacy test last week, but I appreciate that, Doug, very much. Next, we're going to ask our panel to come forward. We're going to ask Mr. Gingrich and Dr. Peter Pry and Scooter Libby and Joe McClelland. And I'll just say that just come up here and sit right here if you would, and we're going to allow you folks to ask them the questions that you have in mind. Let me just say to you, it's hard to give you a long litany of qualifications from these men, but Dr. Peter Pry was the executive director of the EMP Commission, and this is one of the things that essentially woke up the country. We heard in the Armed Services Committee in 2004 the report of this commission, and it was so significant to us that we went into private closed doors and heard the rest of it. And so to suggest, you know, that to be able to really estimate the impact that this man's had is very difficult. In terms of what I might say about Scooter Libby, this man has an awful lot of power behind the scenes. I don't know how he does it, but I will tell you that he's able to speak to the leadership in this Congress in ways that they hear better than anyone else. Joe McClelland is actually the person that is ahead of dealing with this problem. And John Gahl, we'd like you to come up if you would too, sir. But Joe McClelland is the gentleman over at the Federal Energy and Regulatory Commission that deals with this problem, is the one that really we have to look to for the best guidance from the administration's point of view. And I just think that he is not only incredibly informed on this issue, but he's a really good guy. And John Gahl from the University of Missouri, I was out in Missouri here not too long ago. They have an EMP generator out there where we can actually generate EMP and break things and learn about some of the properties of it. And I'm not going to go a lot further than that, but I hope that someone will have the courage to ask the first question. And again, I can't thank you enough for being here.
The question is this: having been involved in this issue with you, Mr. Chairman, and others since 2009, the issue really isn't, will people believe everything we saw? Yes, they'll believe it, but they won't relate it to the daily life that our former speaker made reference to. It's the legislative process where we're running into, we need the finger in the dike. So that it will have a hearing, it'll have a markup, and it'll go to the floor. There are folks that don't agree with us that it's as bad as we say it is. Somehow or other we need to educate them. How would we educate so we can move this piece of legislation?
Well, that's a congressional question, and I'll just quickly touch on it because I want you folks to ask the others here. Dr. Pevsner, would you like to join us up here on the... Dr. Pevsner is a professor over at the University of Missouri and a very well-known person in this regard, too. The challenge that we have, Mr. Sheldon, is that in order to deal with the SHIELD Act, there is concern from certain industry groups that they would have to change the Section 215 which would give government, in their minds, more power than they should have. We have had several opportunities to discuss ways to ameliorate that concern, but it is a concern. And I would just have to say to you that my biggest, I'm just sorry that we're not looking at this for the national security threat that it is, because if we are motivated to find an answer, we can do that. And the SHIELD Act at least is a good start. But, Doug?
Trent, I've got another question for our subject matter experts. And you and I, Trent, on our subcommittee had classified hearings where we've talked about threats. How easy and how hard is it to guard, to harden cars or computers or electrical transformers, other essential elements of our current civilization from EMP?
Dr. Pry, would you want to take that?
Well, the Congressional EMP Commission estimated that it would take $2 billion to provide robust protection of the national electric grid, which is what we spend on foreign aid to Pakistan every year. So a one-time expenditure of $2 billion to protect the lives of hundreds of millions of Americans would seem like a prudent investment. Other critical infrastructures, now you can end up, if you do it badly, you can end up spending vast quantities of money and still not get the job done. But automobiles, there are ideas, even the material cost, it could be less than $100 to protect a modern automobile by using ferrite tubes, for example, to protect the wires in an automobile. I think the Commission's overall estimate for providing robust protection of all of the critical infrastructures was between $10 to $20 billion over a 3 to 5 year period. And that cost, we have found, where the electric grid is concerned, is once you get the private sector, private vendors involved, it's actually come down quite dramatically. Now people are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to $2 billion to protect the national electric grid. I think the FERC, the U.S. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission study, estimated it would cost the average ratepayer an increase in their annual electric bill of 20 cents annually to make this problem go away.
Someone else? Yes, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I was hosted a breakfast recently with one of our commanders of one of our military commands, and I asked him about EMP. His question was what he finds in the government is that the view that a deliberate EMP attack with a missile is something we can identify and that is not going to be done surreptitiously so that deterrence applies. Could you address that, please?
Well, one of the disadvantages of being a historian rather than a lawyer before going into public life is you actually know things. Anybody who has looked at the history of surprise, whether it's Pearl Harbor, it's Yom Kippur, go down the list, Boston, this idea that we can be sure, that we can deter. First of all, I have no idea how you would necessarily deter North Korea on a bad weekend, because I don't think we have any clue what their internal arguments are. Second, I don't know that you could deter an Iran if the right people were in charge, because they might regard dying for Allah to be a positive achievement. So third, the notion that you could automatically trace back and know exactly, particularly if it was fired from a ship. You go down this list and you say, why is it, and this is an Americanism, okay, this is not the particular person you're talking to. There is an American passion for avoiding the lessons of history and assuming that this time will be different. And if there's any lesson history teaches you, it is no, it won't. And we have active enemies who may want to destroy us. And some of them are clever. And to assume, for example, that a Chinese submarine in the shadow of North Korea couldn't fire a missile that we misunderstood and thought was Korean, just as a minor example. Or the fact that the Russians are now operating their nuclear submarines in the southern hemisphere, I think for the first time ever. They didn't used to do that. So how would you know whose submarine fired which missile from which angle? I just think it's anybody who tells you, oh, we've got it under control, is by definition kidding themselves.
If it's all right, I might just expand on that briefly. The problem is if it's known that our grid is vulnerable, it's an invitation to some of the things that the Speaker's talking about. If the grid is not vulnerable, nothing mitigates the threat more than that. Someone else. It's Frank Gaffney.
Thank you. There are many people who've been at this a long time, and I appreciate all the efforts that have been made. I wonder, and I don't know to whom to direct this, I know Peter Pry has spent a lot of time on this, but perhaps others would like to comment too, on the extent to which the North Koreans and the Iranians, for example, to say nothing of the Russians and Chinese, have actually put themselves in a position, or are getting into a position, to inflict this kind of attack on the United States. What do we know about it? How serious and imminent is that threat?
Thank you, Frank. Well, the Commission was told by a delegation of Russian generals back in 2004 that the technology for what the Russians described as super EMP weapons had been transferred to the North Koreans. And that seems to have been borne out by the tests. The 3 tests they conducted have all been very low-yield weapons on the order of just a few kilotons, which would be considered technological failures if we were trying to build a nuclear weapon designed to make blast and explosion. But since a super EMP weapon is tuned, as it were, to produce gamma rays, which is what causes the EMP effect, it won't create a large blast. It will look basically exactly like the North Korean device. Now we know in December, in addition to probably having a weapon like that, they've successfully orbited a satellite over the South Pole, orbited in a direction that had they tweaked it azimuth by just 15 degrees, it would have gone right over the sweet spot for the EMP attack over the 48 contiguous United States, from a direction where we have no interceptors, no ballistic missile early warning radars, we wouldn't even see the attack coming. This thing that the Russians used to call a fractional orbital bombardment system in the Cold War, they probably got from the Russians too. So now they have the ability worldwide to basically put at risk not just the United States, but all the nations in the world. And I'd like to just make one follow-on comment to the question that was asked earlier about the risk, because we are a constant and a threat, because we're constantly, whenever we address these things, we always kind of talk about them, about what if they do indeed attack, and what are the consequences. Colin Gray, if they were in the room today, would probably argue that we're under EMP attack right now. We're under EMP attack right now. The North Koreans are also fans of Sun Tzu, who know that the best strategy is to win a war without violence, without actually having to go to war. They know that we have to do the calculus of strategic risk. What is the price we would have to pay if we come to the aid of our allies in Japan, South Korea? What kind of price point might we pay? Now as of December, they are able to reach out and touch us with an EMP attack. It completely transforms the calculation of risks from the United States point of view. How will our allies perceive U.S. credibility and their ability to rely us on an ally, even without using EMP, just by achieving the technological and theoretical capability to make such an attack? They are already attacking the fundamental basis of the alliance that's preserved peace in Asia for 50 years. Thank you.
Someone else? Yes, sir.
Where is industry in this distinguished panel? Where is GE, Siemens, Verizon, Google, Silver Spring Networks?
Well, they ought to be here, but my friend Joe McClelland here, since it's such an easy, non-political one.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. Industry has been involved in the discussions. They've conducted research, their own research, independently into geomagnetic disturbances. That would be the naturally occurring phenomenon that's inevitable. Those are the coronal mass ejections from the sun that disturb the Earth's magnetic sphere and creates the geomagnetically induced currents that in turn can damage transformers. So the electric industry has been heavily engaged, and we have had first-hand experience with that industry, and I know that they've also engaged the transformer manufacturers to at least study the natural phenomenon associated with this, which would be essentially the E3 effect. It's similar to the E3 effect from the electromagnetic pulse. We also know that E2, as the Congressman described earlier, is lightning, and industry's been heavily engaged with lightning. However, it has not mitigated either E3 or E1, although they study the effects. There's been little to no mitigation put in place to protect against either of those effects.
Someone else? Yes, sir, you in the back.
Hi, I have a lot of questions actually from what's been said so far. I'll try to indicate the direction of them. If you think of defense, if that's the concern, one of the key aspects of that, for example, is being able to have an industry that can produce the infrastructure that you need to replace. For example, right now, a lot of what you're going to be trying to protect are goods that are produced in Japan or China. They're not even produced in the United States. You're saying, you're basically, the nations that you're calling your enemies are actually providing the United States with a lot of these goods. One of the biggest threats that you have in the United States right now is you have a financial system where most of it can become inflation at any point. You can have a financial collapse that can have comparable effects to, for example, a shutdown of the electric grid. That's another aspect of what has to be addressed. The other part of it is, I don't think there is a fundamental reason for the United States to be in conflict with nations like Russia and China. It used to be, for example, under John F. Kennedy, we had a program of collaborating with the Soviet Union to be able to get out of the Cold War. Instead of seeing the achievements of other nations as threats, this is something that you can be happy about, that you can collaborate with other countries for those achievements. It shouldn't necessarily...
Maybe we could get the speaker to address that last part, then Mr. Libby, if you wanted to, if you feel like you could address the transformer redundancy and our ability to produce them here in this country. Is that something you'd be comfortable with? All right.
Well, look, I actually think your point about where the equipment's made is a powerful argument for why you want to protect it once it's here. Because the act of trying to rebuild or replace large electrical generating systems would be a multi-year project, and you would be without electricity for that whole period. As to how you view the world, I think this goes all the way back to George Washington's writings. I think that you can have many nations with whom you are not in conflict, but if they develop certain capabilities, you want to make sure that if they change their opinion, you survive the change. And it is clear that the technology of electromagnetic pulse is going to, in fact, be very widespread. The very same pattern that's going to lead to Pakistan and India, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran to have traditional nuclear weapons. We have now transferred into a world where we're going from traditional weapons to traditional nuclear weapons to now EMP events. That's going to spread. And you can't tell right now, 10 or 15 years from now, who's going to be in charge of any of these countries. And so it's useful for you to have a defensive system that would survive their changing their opinion. And it's a very, very big vulnerability to allow your entire country's survival to be a function of voluntary vulnerability when it can be avoided for a reasonable price.
Mr. Libby, do you want to add anything to that? Okay. Next question. Yes, sir.
What action did the Maine state legislature take? How effective was it? And what are the pros and cons of trying to duplicate that process at the state level and other states?
That state of Maine? Someone. Who would like to take that question?
I'll take that since I was involved in the passage of the in the state of Maine. And I don't know if Maine State Representative Trent came in here today. She was invited. It was passed by the governor on the 6th of June, the anniversary of D-Day, so it's only very recently passed. But it had unanimous support from the Maine House, the Joint Energy Committee, which was a House-Senate organization, passed it unanimously, and it passed the Senate in the state of Maine by, I believe it was 182-3. And basically what it does is it requires them to do a study on the various vulnerabilities of both nuclear and natural EMP to the state Maine electric grid, and to come up with cost-effective alternatives. What are the most cost-effective alternatives? The decision has been made to go forward to protect the grid. Now it's just a question, what is the pathway? What is the most cost-effective pathway? In terms of effectiveness, my God, sir, the state of Maine has restored my faith in democracy. You know, I and others have been hammering my head against the wall in Washington for years. In fact, since 2008, when the EMP Commission delivered its report, we've been hoping that something like the GRID Act or the SHIELD Act would pass. Mr. Franks has labored for years to try to get the SHIELD Act passed. You know, years, and it hasn't passed. We haven't done anything here in Washington to protect the national electric grid. When I went up to Maine, and others of my colleagues went up to Maine, that was in February, you know, 5 months ago. And and almost nobody had heard of the EMP in the state of Maine. But that Maine legislature, they got it, they understood the threat, and now it's less than 6 months later, they've already passed basically a Maine version of the SHIELD Act to protect their grid. So I'd say right now they're going great guns. I wish Washington would follow their example.
Thank you, sir. Someone else? Yes, sir.
Question for Dr. Bryant. Did the Commission have some estimates on the loss of life following the EMP attack in the United States over a period of time?
Yes, it did. The Commission estimated that within 12, given our current state of unpreparedness, which is what we are right now, that within 12 months of the EMP event, we would likely lose someplace between 2/3 and 90% of the population to starvation, disease, and societal collapse.
He's just full of happy thoughts, isn't he?
Well, it's not, you know, the 2/3, we were actually, originally, that was our sort of our official estimate, 2/3, 2 out of 3 Americans dead. But we actually received criticism for that from Smart Guy, with the former chairman of the National Intelligence Council, who argued that was an optimistic estimate, you know, because we were looking at, well, what is the national carrying capability of the land? You subtract modern technology, critical infrastructures to support 310 million Americans. How many Americans could we support in this country? Well, if you go back to 1900, you know, it was about 100 million Americans. But Fritz Ehrmark, the gentleman I referred to, former chairman of the NIC, pointed out that those 100 million Americans in 1900, 75% of them were farmers, and 1%, one generation removed at most from survivalists who knew how to live off the land. The Americans who would be surviving in the post-EMP environment are not farmers, don't have survival skills. And so a lot of people think of the higher estimate, on the order of 90%, might be more realistic.
Mr. Speaker, do you want to?
Yeah, let me pick up on this, because part of what happens is when you get to a certain number, it gets so large, people's eyes glaze over and they can't think about it. So I want to give you just 2 things to think about. I believe if you had a continent-wide EMP event, which would probably take 2 or 3 weapons, you would probably lose between 70 and 90% of the country, unless you got massive input from other countries that were not affected, in which case you would, of course, have given up our sovereignty and ceased to be an independent nation. But you literally could find yourself in that desperate a situation. And you would have thought, and again, Trent has shown great leadership on this, and before him, Roscoe was out there showing great leadership, you'd think that a threat which could be 2/3 of the population, people would pay attention to this. But it's just their eyes glaze over, partly because they don't want to divert the resources. They don't want to think about it. It's too hard. And so that's why you've got to keep coming back and keep... The SHIELD Act is the first common sense practical step towards getting us in position to survive what could be a horrendous event. The other comments I make to all of you is, if you go to Holland, where they have dealt with a rising sea for a long time, they have an astonishing dike system. No one in Holland makes the argument, since we haven't been flooded in the last 30 years, why do we have to keep investing? Because everybody understands that if the dikes collapsed, we lose about 1/3 of Holland. And so the very success that it doesn't collapse guarantees they keep reinvesting to make sure it doesn't collapse. We somehow have to get EMP into that kind of a situation. This is a threat so horrendous that if we don't get it fixed, we run a risk of losing the nation, unlike virtually any other thing I can think of except potentially cyber warfare. These are the only 2 things that are civilization changers in the short run.
Someone else? Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
One reason that people's eyes glaze over are some horrendous is that they don't understand the feasibility of the solution. So they immediately just veer off. But my understanding is that other countries, maybe the United Kingdom, Israel, other ones, have at least started at a demonstration level hardening some of their grid and protecting it from EMP. But that's not getting communicated back to the United States, that we are way behind the curve here. Could any of you address that?
Mr. Libby, could you address that?
Demonstration of power electricity. I know that there have been talks. The member of parliament is very concerned with this. It has their defense committee, and there have been discussions in Israel. I don't know what steps they've actually taken.
You know, I would say that we just had our electric infrastructure secured in Washington, and I have forgotten to mention that even is the person on the Democrat side that helps to chair that. I chair it on the Republican side. And the Israel contingency was there, and they believe now that Israel is, to use their words, that Israel is awake on this issue because they have some special vulnerabilities that are even more significant in the United States. And they pointed out the very thing that the lady asks about, and that is sometimes, you know, a threat, just because it's bad, the idea of a planet hitting the Earth is not just real encouraging, but we say, okay, we can't do anything about it, and it's so remote. But she's correct. We have to be able to relay the message that this is a fixable thing. This is an attractive threat to address, because it's not only very serious, it's not only very plausible, but it's fixable. And those are the things we need to focus our attention on. And we'll have another couple of questions now, but I wonder if I could ask a question myself to Dr. Gahl, and that is, what do you think are the best ways that we can demonstrate to society in general some of the realities of this within the laboratory setting?
Well, you know, we have long experience associated with these effects. We hardened our military infrastructure against such attacks, and I believe the congressman spent hundreds of millions of dollars. I would disagree. I would probably spend billions of dollars.
I've learned my lesson about overstating anything here lately, so I deliberately understate those things. But hundreds of millions is still accurate. It's just really hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions.
That's right. So the technology, the equipment, the machines that you would require to simulate these environments were built in the 70s, a long time ago. And while we've had weapon systems exposed to these radiation environments, nobody got around to exposing transformers and protective relays and the SCADA equipment associated with the power distribution system. So it is a fairly straightforward affair to irradiate this equipment and see what happens. And when those things happen, my sense is that many of the fixes are very straightforward and inexpensive to apply.
All right, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have two more questions. We're going to have two more questions, and then we'll let each person just, if they want to take a shot at it, if there's anything that they want to say here that they haven't said, or you can pass it to the next one. So we'll go to you first, sir.
Hello, for the speaker and others. I had a question about getting more support from the American people at large. And I'm wondering, as we explain the EMP issues and the opportunities to do things like the SHIELD Act and what Maine has done, are there ways that local communities can feel like there's something in their power that they can likewise do? For example, having EMP-protected microgrids, the encouragement for local communities to be more robust and self-reliant in any of the critical infrastructure areas, so that everybody feels like they can do something themselves rather than just let experts, say, in Washington or utilities do it because they're not a Washington person or they're not a utility, but they can do something maybe with their local community. Is there something that we can do to engage them at that level simultaneously?
Okay.
Homeland Security passing new national planning scenario focused on. If that happened, and they added that, you see the national planning scenarios are basic means for all federal, state, and local emergency planning, training, and resource allocation. this would finally put it on the radar screen for local agency responders that say, oh, the Department of Homeland Security acknowledges this threat. Here's the scenario, and we can start planning against it. And there are numerous things that people can do, individuals as well as local police departments. Even if it's something, investing in a $25 lighting bulb, for example, so that you can access the gas stations and keep your ambulances, fire trucks, and police cars running. You know, there's just numerous things you can do. You know, putting radio equipment or sensitive medical equipment, the garbage can that's lined with a plastic bag, that's very cage, so you can protect things really cheaply. You know, everybody in this room, if you've got electronics at home or something that would be absolutely indispensable in an emergency, you know, get a metal garbage can with a tight fitting lid, put the thing in the plastic bag and put it in there. That'll protect it even against a super EMP weapon if the lid is tight. But I could go on forever over time constraints.
Yes, sir.
Trent, would you discuss or tell us what you added to the defense authorization bill with respect to EMP this last couple of weeks?
Yes, we were able to get, in my judgment, very important language in the DOD bill, and if it survives the Senate, you know, I mentioned that challenge earlier. If it survives the Senate, then this would be something that I think is very important. It essentially would allow the DOD to ask them to do an assessment of all of their defense critical and their task critical assets, which are very significant to the national security of this country, and require, or at least empower them to require their source of electricity to be impervious or at least EMP protected. And the whole concept there was that we don't have to argue with the military about this. The generals get this, and they have taken steps. And we think if we can sort of engage them in the PR battle, where they understand the obvious need to be able to have a source of electricity that is reliable, that we can bring the dialogue along, and then hopefully it'll make a lot of difference in that regard. So we really have been able to make some pretty significant things, and we've got some other things in the sort of in the queue right now that would be going to the Homeland Security Committee. We're having difficulty, I'll just be very candid with you, we're having difficulty getting our bills heard in the Energy and Commerce Committee, and if you are able to figure that out, you'll certainly, it'd be great if you'd inform me. So thank you for that question. So what I'd like to do is start down here with Dr. Gahl and come this way, and just if you have something else that you'd like to say, and please feel free.
Well, the one thing that I would mention, the one gentleman asked the question, well, many of the most vulnerable components within the system are foreign made. It's the semiconductors, the microprocessors that are within the various equipment. And he's right that those are probably the most vulnerable components. But it's not a situation in which we have to make those components onshore. There's lots of simple solutions that could be implemented that could simply protect those devices, irrespective of where they were made, that could be implemented into the system to help protect. What can people do? You know, when you have discussions with very smart utility guys whose day-to-day job is to keep the grid up and running, and you discuss with them what the risk is, you get this, expression on their face that they hadn't really thought about that, but man, that would be a huge problem. And the deal is that just talking about the problem or discussing it would, particularly with those kinds of people, because if they see a system failure, the typical way that a system fails is not with this sort of an attack. If this sort of attack occurred, the failure would occur, there would be different ramifications, the SCADA would be down, the various controls would be down, and if they were thinking about that and were aware that what could happen, they could respond to such an attack in a much more intelligent way.
Joe McClelland.
Earlier on with electromagnetic pulse, E1, E2, and E3, although the nuclear detonation generates all three, we've seen effects and we've seen significant developments with the three components. E2 is an everyday occurrence with lightning, so we can set that aside and say it's mitigated, but E3, for instance, is very much, the effect is very much like a solar storm. So in 1989, we had a relatively mild solar storm. It really wasn't much to speak of. And yet the Quebec province collapsed. and it collapsed for 6 million people didn't have service for approximately 7 hours. It collapsed in 90 seconds. The cost was $1 to $2 billion with relatively mild damage. A real E3 effect would cause substantial destruction. It would cost much more and would mean that sustained period of outage. So we've seen E3, we've seen this already occur. E1, I don't know if anyone's familiar, has followed there was an announcement in October of last year where the Air Force announced the results of its CHAMP missile. CHAMP is a microwave array that's mounted on a missile. It was fired at a building with computer systems and it flattened it. Wildly successful. The technology is coming to a theater near you. You can go online and you can Google specific manufacturers, D-I-E-H-L, and you can buy an IEMI device. That simulates E1. So at the same time that these technologies are being perfected, they're being distributed, they're becoming more affordable to people that would use them against us. There's the same type, there's a convergence with a susceptibility to the grid. EEI estimates that $6.8 trillion are expected to be spent on reliability on the power grid over the next 20 years. $8 billion were spent for energy efficiency improvements in 2012 alone. Now those efficiency improvements might mean lower loss transformers, which indeed might be more susceptible to GMD. So at the same time that we're making investments, technology is becoming more widely available that's lethal to the power system and could be distributed to those that would do us harm. At the same time, the grid's becoming more vulnerable to these aspects. So although we haven't seen a nuclear detonation, we have seen the effects, and the effects could be very devastating to civilization. In fact, civilization-ending effects.
Mr. Speaker.
People communicating to everyone they know that it matters and describing to them the cost of not doing something to fix it. And describing these first steps in the SHIELD Act are stunningly reasonable. And compared to the cost of a carrier battle group, or compared to the cost of the next bomber, I mean, defending our capacity to ensure the survival of our civilization by making sure we have reliable electricity, whether it's a solar event or it's a man-made event, is so high up the chain of things we have to focus on that I think it simply requires enough people talking to enough people. And I think this will happen. I think we will be able to put this together.
Dr. Pry?
I'd like to respond to a question that was asked earlier about what's happening with other countries. Taiwan and South Korea have launched pretty ambitious programs to protect their critical infrastructure against the Taiwanese because they fear an attack from China, and South Korea because they fear an attack from North Korea. But the countries, there are only 2 countries in the world that are really prepared for this eventuality, whether it's natural or nuclear EMP, have been well prepared for some decades. That is Russia and China. During the Cold War, they prepared to fight and win a nuclear war, part of them protected all of their critical infrastructure, so they're basically ready for it. I'd ask you to imagine a scenario where we do have a recurrence of a Carrington-class geomagnetic storm. Not a nuclear war, but a natural event that takes out the world electrical grids. And the only ones left standing are Russia and China, probably North Korea, because they basically are not a modern society. They don't have any critical infrastructure. Do we want to really be at the mercy of Russia, China, and North Korea? Thank you.
Scooter Libby.
I guess I'd make 2 comments that may not have been covered so far. First is we've heard some talk about deterrence. What does that really mean? After we have suffered a massive attack of the sort that's been described, we're not going to be able to launch conventional warships, conventional military forces, thousands of miles overseas. So what everyone is really thinking when they say deterrence is a nuclear attack on whoever perpetrated this, if we can figure out who they are. What does that mean? That means pointing nuclear missiles at civilian populations and killing many, many people. That's not something we should weep to do. It's not the way Americans should normally want to do it. We have an opportunity here for a reasonable cost to prevent such a horrific thing from being presented to the President of the United States. So set aside all of our debt, look at the morality of what we're proposing to do by way of defense. It's unattractive. Second point I would make is after the 9/11 attacks, the speaker spoke about historians looking at surprise. People went back and looked at that, and they said, the National Commission said it was a failure of imagination. That was really not true. It was rhetorically effective, but it wasn't really true. There have been many commissions in the 1990s, the speaker knows about some of these that we helped create, which looked at the possibility of horrific terrorist attacks on America. And in fact, the potential casualties were much, much greater than the horrific casualties we suffered on 9/11. It was not a failure of imagination, it was a failure of responsibility. And that's what we have here. Everyone in this room now has imagined, and through the EIS Council, many other people have imagined this. The trick is to take effective action on it. And that takes political courage of the sort that Congressman Franks has shown. It's not so easy to stand up as a public figure and take on a remote contingency like this and treat it as a serious matter. And I think we all owe him a bit of thanks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I was told the other day that there's a fine line between gutsy and stupid, so I want to be sure that we don't cross that line. Dr. Pevsner, you have dominated the conversation, but we've saved you for last. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I would only say this. We've had a long interest in trauma of the nervous system. And we've demonstrated recently, unequivocally, in animal, and would apply to certainly experimental animals, but also food animals and human beings, that EMP causes serious change in the central nervous system. So while everything you've listened to talks about hardware effects, the people who might be left to fix it aren't going to be able to do it because their brains aren't going to be able to work very well. So I think this is a critical point that must be made, and one that may, while it will be very emotive, it certainly will get the attention, I think, that it needs to get this thing going.
Well, the hope is we won't be dealing with the kind of intensities that would board. And I just want to thank everybody again for coming. And I just want to probably remind everybody in closing here that every vulnerability throughout history that a particular country has had, usually their enemies exploited it, because the enemy gets a vote in this thing, and they're aware of the vulnerability that America has. And I'm afraid my biggest concern is that we've sort of issued an invitation to people to in such a probably ultimate asymmetric fashion, and it's important that we mitigate it while we can. It's simple enough to do that. All of you are a critical part of that process, and I hope that someday that we're all maybe watching TV or doing a barbecue or something like that, and maybe some EMP event so significant has an effect so small that only a few of us will know the disaster that was averted, or maybe we'll never know. Maybe we will do what's necessary to prevent the disaster from ever occurring by mitigating against the threat and making ourselves no longer a target. With that, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I remind you finally that the more we sweat in peace, the less we bleed in war. God bless you.